Craig Krull, and this is the 30th anniversary of Craig Krull Gallery here at Bergamot Station. And my career in the arts started back in high school, really, working for an auction company. And then I ended up working for 3 dealers in Southern California in the 80s when I was in my 20s. 3 very different dealers: Ace Gallery, Robbert Flick Gallery, and Jan Turner Gallery. All very different programs, different ways of doing business. So I learned a lot. Then in 1991, Jan Turner moved from 8000 Melrose to 9006 Melrose, and the new location happened to have a beautiful honey wood floor mezzanine space that I fell in love with. And I went to my boss and said, I'd like to open my own gallery in your gallery, which took her by surprise, but we were in the middle of a terrible recession, trying to survive, and she said, why not? So we opened what became Turner Krull Gallery, upstairs from Jan Turner Gallery at 9006 Melrose. And I was always interested in photography. I had curated many photo shows for Jan at her previous location. So we agreed that I would continue doing that and focus exclusively on photo-based media while she did her program downstairs. So it was kind of a caveat that I would do only photography and be a complement rather than competition to what she was doing downstairs. One of the other things I enjoyed about my location at 9006 Melrose is that it had historical significance for me because Dennis Hopper took his very famous double standard photograph from the intersection of Santa Monica, Doheny, and Melrose, looking right at my gallery. So that was almost, I think it was exactly 30 years earlier that he took that photograph. And I ended up representing Dennis, doing several solo shows and including him in several group exhibitions. One of those group exhibitions was called Action, Performance, and the Photograph. I was more interested in the use of photography for conceptual purposes, and this exhibition, Action, Performance, and the Photograph, traced the evolution and relationship between still photography to performance art and how it became an integral aspect of performance art. And people like Chris Brittin and Paul McCarthy and Alan Caprow and Carolee Schneemann. In fact, those 4 were on a panel discussion we had on the subject. But I also showed some very important photographers who weren't getting the attention they deserved. The photo world thought they were big names, but the general public wasn't aware of them just yet. People like William Eggleston, Robert Adams, Ray Metzger, Frederick Sommer, who still is not as well known as he should be, but we managed to get Fred to come out from Arizona all the way to West Hollywood, which he never left Arizona. It was a small community still in the photo world. People like John Divola, Anthony Hernandez, Robbert Flick, later Ann Callis, and in particular Edmund Teske, who I loved. And I have a lot of respect for Edmund, one of my favorite artists. He was a very spiritual photographer practicing Vedanta Hinduism and used his darkroom as an alchemical laboratory. When the Getty did their retrospective, they called it Spirit into Matter. When I opened Turner Krull Gallery in '91, my first exhibition was called Photographing LA Architecture. And as a native Angeleno and someone who's interested in place, it was the perfect way to start the gallery. I've always liked the quote by the poet Gary Snyder, who said our place is part of what we are. Now this exhibition included some important photographers that you wouldn't necessarily associate with architectural photography: Henry Wessel, Robert Adams, Edmund Teske, Anthony Hernandez, and Julius Shulman, who is the most important architectural photography, not only in LA, but probably in the history of photography. I went to Julius's house on Woodrow Wilson up at the top of Mulholland, introduced myself as a young gallerist opening his first gallery, wanting to show his photographs in a group exhibition about architecture. Of course, he was delighted, but he started to show me pictures of his sunsets and boats in Hawaii and thought, isn't this what people in galleries will want? And I said, no, they'll want your architectural work. And even though he was highly regarded, he didn't believe that his work would do well in a fine art gallery context, and didn't understand how I was going to do that. So it was a revelation for Julius. It's been written about and talked about. He's been interviewed about this, and he was completely blown away when we sold our first photograph of his for $1,200, which, if you drove to Julius's house back in the day and introduced yourself, he would give you his photographs, or he would charge you $30 to have something printed. So he was completely unaware of the marketability, I should say, of his work. We ended up opening at Bergamot Station here in 1994, and my first exhibition at Bergamot was a solo show of Julius Shulman's work. And that exhibition got reviews in Art Forum, Frieze, LA Times, all the major publications got it instantly. And his work was recontextualized from a commercial genre into a fine art context. And it was a whole new career for him. He and his wife, Olga, had planned to retire in Florida and buy a condo in Hollywood, Florida. They changed their minds. I feel sorry for Olga. But he had a whole new career. We got him exhibitions in San Francisco, Atlanta, New York, Toronto, London, Paris, Berlin, Munich, Milan, and then Benedict Taschen began to publish his works as well, and then we sold his archive to the Getty in 2004. At Turner Krull Gallery for 3 years on Melrose, we were just barely coming out of the recession, still looking for ways to survive, and a dealer here in town named Wayne Blank was a real estate adventurer and had a lot of contacts with the city of Santa Monica, had done some work at the Santa Monica airport, and he came to some galleries that he thought would be a compatible group and said, I have this idea. It's a big 5-acre property. It's a little run down. They called it Wayne's World at the time. And come see what we can do here. So you had to squint your eyes a little bit because it was ramshackle and birds were flying in and out of this building. And he said, I plan on putting 20 or 30 galleries in here. Would you like to be one? And of course, that was a golden opportunity for me because I was able to move up from having been a partner in a gallery to having my own gallery with my own name on it. And so we came here in September of '94, and our first opening night was September 17th. They say we had tens of thousands of people. I would not be surprised. There was traffic back down the Santa Monica Freeway. Because of the fact that we were in a recession and people were writing about how they didn't know how the LA art world was going to survive this recession, it was an instant boost to the energy of Southern California's art world. It went overnight. When Bergamot Station opened, there was a vibrance in the art world. Everyone was talking about it. Everyone felt like the recession was over. Happy times were here again. And I was lucky to have as my neighbors Burnett Miller on one side, Rosamund Felsen on the other side, Patricia Four at the end of the building. These are legendary LA dealers who all came together and made some magic happen at Bergamot Station. And we were the talk of the town. So when I walked into Bergamot Station, it was a ramshackle collection of dilapidated buildings that had been unused for at least a few decades. It was a train station all the way back at the turn of the century, but it was, at this time, an empty parking lot with buildings that were barely standing. And Wayne Blank, the landlord who got the master lease from the city of Santa Monica and invited all of us galleries to be here, let us choose which space we wanted. I chose what I think is the best space in the B building. I was able to design my own space. He brought in a drywall crew and put up the walls pretty quickly. And the way I laid out my space is, at the time I was still transitioning from photography into other art forms. And I prefer a space that has surprises in it. I've never been a fan of the big white box where you walk into a gallery and you see the entire exhibition at one time. I like exhibitions that unravel and unfold and reveal themselves and make relationships from room to room, where you have framing devices where you're in one room and look into the next room and are framed by something that's making a relationship or a complement. And I also designed it so it would have more walls, so there would be more exhibition space for photographs. But I also liked the fact that we could do 2 or 3 exhibitions at the same time that worked off of each other. One of the strengths of my exhibition program is the way that I have put exhibitions together, put solo shows, 2 or 3 solo shows at the same time that somehow work, whether they're completely diametrically opposed or they're very complementary. There's some dialogue between every exhibition that I do that enhances the other show. One of my closest relationships in life and in the gallery was with Peter Alexander. And I met Peter when I was still in college. I was dating the woman that was his studio assistant, and I was in awe, and we hit it off immediately. We talked about Baja California and how we liked camping, and we were close friends ever since. And when I opened my gallery here at Bergamot Station, I was still very involved in photography, and I was remembering some of the photographs, the Polaroids that I saw in Peter's studio when I visited him in college. And I said, hey, can I look at those Polaroids again? And he was very excited to hear that, because no one had paid much attention to his photo work up until then. And we did a project of printing his Polaroids onto Japanese Gampi paper, which accentuated the ethereal quality and some of the effects of the artificial light on the Polaroid camera. And I worked with Peter throughout the rest of his life and did some incredible exhibitions. One time we were at a Lakers game, and we were with the owners of the Fairmont Miramar Hotel. And Peter proposed the idea that they give him a bungalow at the Miramar for 2 months for free to make paintings. It was a good way for them to promote the hotel. He did paintings of the pool and distant paintings of the Santa Monica Pier and the lights at night on the ocean. And we did the exhibition in the ballroom of the Miramar Hotel because it seemed to be the most appropriate venue. We also did an exhibition with Peter of his paintings, his studies for Blue, which was a mural that he did for the Disney Hall. And Frank Gehry asked Peter to do the work for the Disney Hall. It's the only artist that Frank asked to contribute, and it's the only artwork other than Frank's sculptural work itself in the Disney Hall. We've shown everything that Peter's made, from his paintings, prints, photographs, resins, velvets, and in my opinion, he is the quintessential California artist. I can't think of anyone else who embodies the essence of California light and space more than Peter Alexander. In 1995, we mounted an exhibition of Eleanor Antin's 100 Boots. She's a conceptual artist who uses photography to document stage scenarios and performances. In this case, 100 boots, 100 rubber boots, were placed in various scenarios, such as walking around the corner, going to the supermarket, going to the drive-in theater, going to the bank, and they became postcards. They became mail art, and mail art was very big back in the early 70s. And she would mail these to a mailing list who were fortunate recipients of this incredible work of art. And there were 51 in the series, and at the end of the series, she was invited to show them at the Museum of Modern Art. Here are the boots marching into MoMA, and this is them on the ferry. You can see the World Trade Center. A few years after our exhibition, the LA County Museum did a major survey of Eleanor Antin, and they photographed the 100 boots walking into the museum. And we sold the entire project of the boots, the postcards, all the ephemera that went along with the project to the museum. When I did an exhibition called Photographing the LA Art Scene, which was always a project that I had in the back of my mind, because as an art historian, when you look at an art history book, in the beginning, in the essays, you'll see little small photographs in the margins of artists in their studio in their early days, and I was always captivated by those photographs and thought what a great project that would be. So I went to the photographers of the period. This book was called Photographing the LA Art Scene, 1955 to 1975, and I contacted photographers like Julian Wasser, William Claxton, Jerry McMillan, Charles Brittin, Marvin Silver, Malcolm Lubliner, and they were all thrilled to participate because they all had incredible images of the LA art scene in the 50s and 60s. Many of them were iconic, but some of them had never been seen before. We ended up working with some brilliant photographers who documented that period. One of them was Charles Brittin, who was a photographer of the Black Panther movement and the Beat generation, especially Wallace Berman, who was a close pal of his. We ended up doing later a big survey exhibition of Charles's work, which was the first time that had happened. And we did a catalog, and it was co-curated by the great Walter Hopps, who was the founder of Ferris Gallery. We also worked with William Claxton, who was a great jazz photographer and contributed photographs to the LA art scene as well. And he famously photographed his wife, Peggy Moffett, wearing the couture of Rudy Gernrich, who was a fashion designer here in Los Angeles, and that was an exhibition we did a few years later. Also, Julian Wasser, who photographed Marcel Duchamp at his retrospective at the Pasadena Art Museum in '63. He photographed him playing chess with the nude Eve Babbitt. That was his most famous picture, but we've worked with him over the years until he recently passed away. And of course, we've worked for a very long time with Jerry McMillan, who came out to California in the late 50s with Ed Ruscha. Like Llyn Foulkes, I've always been an admirer of Alexis Smith. I didn't think I would ever have the opportunity to show her, but like my relationship with Llyn, I thought, I'll try. And I was hugely surprised when she said she would work with me, and we did a couple exhibitions, and her work is characterized, as you know, with combining simple elements of popular culture, like this one, which is a print of a simple landscape with a ruler on top, which suggests our measurement of the landscape. And the ruler also says, Smokey the Bear says, don't play with matches. And that's another example of our attempt to control nature. This came from an exhibition called Second Nature, which was a double entendre. And we did another exhibition called On Point, which included many needlepoint works, which is another double entendre, which she's very witty and playful with her words, her puns, and her assemblage. Another of the artist relationships that I, to this day, cherish is with Jerry McMillan. And Jerry went to high school with Ed Ruscha and Joe Good. They were all Oklahoma boys, and they all drove out to California together in the late 50s and shared a house and went to Chenard. They all pursued their artistic careers. And Jerry was the photographer of the group and ended up taking a lot of photographs of Ed Ruscha. Some of these are very iconic photographs to this day. In fact, we did an entire book called Picturing Ed, Jerry McMillan's photographs of Ed Ruscha, because a lot of those photographs Ed ended up using for conceptual purposes, like the picture that Jerry made of Ed and a couple girls in bed that was made into a full-page ad in Art Forum magazine with the words below it, Ed Ruscha says goodbye to college joys. Another project that Jerry did were his photographs of Judy Chicago. And Judy was Judy Garowitz, and she was the tough scrapper in the LA art world, one of the only women, fiercely proud and wanted to not be one of the boys, but compete with the boys. So Jerry came up with this idea of photographing her in a boxing ring. And it was an exhibition announcement, it was an Art Forum magazine advertisement. It was the first time she used the name Judy Chicago. And they had t-shirts made with her name on it. They put her in this boxing ring, and they were given like 5 minutes by the manager of the ring. And they ran in there and took these pictures. And that's the legendary photograph of her in the boxing ring. I mention these photographs because Jerry was one of the inventors of a very unique thing that was happening in Southern California in the 60s, and that was photographing artists in scenarios that were used for promotional purposes. And it partially came about because we were in Hollywood, but also it was a very small art world, and there were a lot of competing egos, and they loved to take pictures of each other. There's Ken Price surfing, which is a very famous image that was used for an invitation. Jerry became one of the innovators in that, which I sometimes call the single frame performance art, because they were performing for the camera. And the Picturing Ed book, I was looking for a striking cover and was looking at his contact sheets through a loop, and I came across this one picture of Ed with 6 of his books stacked on his head, and I had never seen it before. And I said, Jerry, what's this? And he said, oh, I've never printed that before. No one's ever seen that picture before. And we ended up putting it on the cover of the book, and it has now become one of those iconic pictures that Sotheby's and Christie's and Phillips asks for all the time. I'm also very honored to represent Don Bachardy. And Don grew up here in Southern California, attending movie premieres at the Grauman's Chinese Theater and collecting autographs from Marilyn Monroe and other superstars, and met the love of his life, Christopher Isherwood, the English author, on the beach in Santa Monica, and spent the rest of his life with Chris. And Chris encouraged him to draw, and Don became the most important portrait artist in America, in my opinion, doing not only portraits of his partner Chris, but legends in the acting field, Hollywood, his fellow artists, authors like Joan Didion and Allen Ginsberg. Everyone that you can think of that has passed through LA has wanted their portrait done by Don. And Don has become a pillar in the queer community. He's told me stories about being in LA in the 60s and police raiding parties at the time, which is unbelievable that that kind of thing happened, but he endured that. We've done so many great exhibitions. One of them, portraits of LA artists. The entire exhibition was actually purchased by our friend and the great collector Beth DeWoody. It's quite an experience to sit quietly for a few hours and watch Don stare very intently into your eyes. And his portraits are magnificent, and they've changed over the years quite a lot. He used to have a very fine, delicate pencil and ink approach, and then he became a little wilder and juicier and more flamboyant and painterly in later years. This is a self-portrait. I've always admired the work of Llyn Foulkes. He's one of the great California artists, an outlier unlike anyone else. It seems like he always gets close to becoming a superstar and then backs away. He's tough, he's visceral, he's real. He doesn't pay attention to the art world, he pays attention to his own work. And when I went to see him the first time, I was, of course, in awe, and he gave me this little artwork from 1961, which was very early in his career. And to give me a gem like this on our first meeting meant so much to me. And I took the chance to ask him if he would consider showing with me. And he said yes. And I was completely thrilled. Growing up in Los Angeles, I was keenly aware of Chicano culture, from the fiestas to the lowriders to the music, and also the things that were happening politically, like the United Farm Workers and the Chicano Moratorium, which was a series of protests and marches against the Vietnam War. I was young, but I was aware of a shift that was happening, even with the name Chicano, because it originally was a derogatory phrase and later became a word of empowerment, Chicano power. And I was lucky to be able to work with who many people consider the grandfather of the Chicano arts movement, and that was Carlos Almaraz, when I worked for Jan Turner in the 80s. Carlos formed, along with Gilbert Lujan, Frank Romero, and Beta de la Rocha, a Chicano arts collective called Los Four, Later, Judith Hernandez wanted to join the group because it was all men, and she said, you need a woman. So it became, in essence, Los Five, even though they didn't change the name. They had an exhibition at the LA County Museum in 1974, which was the first time Chicano arts had been recognized by a major institution. Interestingly, at the same time, another Chicano arts collective called OSCO was formed, including Gronk, who we're showing now, and Willie Herone, Harry Gamboa Jr., and Patsy Valdez. And they tagged the LA County Museum around the same time, a little bit before the Los Four show, because they were protesting the fact that the LA County Museum thought Chicano art was folk art and graffiti art, and they were obviously upset by that and tagged their names on the museum itself. So we represent the estates of Gilbert Lujan. We also represent Judith Hernandez, all three from the Los Four group. Judith just had a survey exhibition at the Cheech Museum here in Riverside. We also represent Gronk, and we represent Dora de Larios, who was the great Latina ceramist who passed away just a few years ago. And we just started working with Jose Lozano, and we also work with some very young LA Chicano artists, Javier Carrillo, Victor Reyes, Emmanuel Galvez. James Fee's photographic practice was like Jack Kerouac, driving back and forth endless times across the country, photographing abandoned factories, rusted ships, old rail yards, and the decay of American civilization. And he said, there's a lot of darkness in my work. It's very dark. It's dark both mentally and physically. Sadly, when he passed away, we had a memorial here in the gallery. And in the midst of the memorial, I told the attendants that the night before, I had a call from James in the middle of the night, woke me up from a deep sleep. And James said to me, don't forget to tell him about the light. Of course, I was dreaming. The central story of James and his family was the fact that his father was a Marine and was part of the campaign in Peleliu. It was a horrific battle that the Marines fought against the Japanese on the island of Peleliu. And it was one of those battles that they sent flamethrowers into the caves to get the Japanese out. And in fact, some Japanese were discovered many years later in these caves. And his father was traumatized by this central event in his life. When he got home, would dress up his son James in army fatigues and have actual live pistols and say, up and at 'em. It went through the entire course of their family life, this lingering trauma. And eventually in the 60s, when the Vietnam War was happening, James was not only encouraged, but his father demanded that he join the armed forces. And James would have none of that. And there was a scene where James was running around town in Iowa trying to escape from his father, and his father was running around town saying, "Where's James?" And it was a horrible father and son moment. He loved his father, but at this particular juncture, it was a conflict of generations. And James left. He got in a car and drove to San Francisco. It was 1967. He met Annie Leibovitz and Janis Joplin, and he was in an entirely different culture, and he did not go to Vietnam. And a few years later, he would get calls from his father threatening suicide, and he would always brush it aside. And one time, of course, his father said, "I'm doing it," and James brushed it aside again, and his father killed himself. And many years later, James, as a cathartic exercise in trying to come through this lifelong family crisis, went to the island of Peleliu about 5 or 6 times and photographed it, and did an incredible project, because the island of Peleliu, when he visited in the late 90s, was still strewn with the remnants of war. There were sunken, submerged Japanese Zero airplanes, there were tanks, there were swords in the water. It was extraordinary, the pictures that he brought home. And there was a book project done, and we did an exhibition of that work. And that's the kind of photographer that James was. He made the personal a universal story. This ore is part of an installation of an exhibition that we did with Michael Deyermond about 8 years ago. We've done several since. He went to Phillips Academy on the East Coast, really one of the most prestigious prep schools in the country, but was the rebel, the lone wolf, the iconoclast, the poet. He was always calling himself a poet. He left school and came to California and continues to make poetry, unlike anything else I've ever known before, because he doesn't just write it down, he paints it on big paintings, he paints it on ores, he paints it on books, he transforms books. This is Moby Dick, and he retitled it I Hunt Me. So a lot of his work is angst-ridden, it's full of love and rejection and tragedy and loss and beauty. He's a true poetic soul that I love dearly, and we've done several exhibitions, all of them installation-oriented. This exhibition, he had a wooden rowboat in the middle of the gallery on a pile of sand and books on the sand as if he were on a desert island. And the ore says, once you get to California, the only place left to go is you. Because he also has this ongoing theme about California being the paradise, the rainbow at the end of the long road, the dreams that are all supposed to come true when you get here, which never do. In fact, he's planning and working towards a large Hollywood sign in Northern California that will float across the hillside the way the Hollywood sign does, saying, I thought California could save me. One of the artists that I work with who is very, very dear to me and one of my best friends is Phranc, P-H-R-A-N-C. She's a singer-songwriter, native of Los Angeles, of the queer community, and got her legs and her encouragement early on in the Women's Building here in Los Angeles. And she was part of the punk rock movement in LA and exited punk rock when she was fed up with people wearing swastikas, partially because she's Jewish. And she went on to create her new career as a singer-songwriter in folk music. And her first album had this crew cut look that she still maintains. And so I knew of her. And when I was at Bergamot Station here, I was at my local Ralph's Market, and there was someone bagging my groceries with that same crew cut. And I looked down at her name tag and it said Phranc. And I thought, what in the heck is Phranc doing here at Ralph's bagging groceries? And I introduced myself and I said, what are you doing here? And she said, well, I love baking, and in order to get into the baking department at Ralph's, you have to bag groceries for 3 weeks. So that's the kind of fun person she is. She has pie parties every New Year's Day. She was a Tupperware salesperson for many years, and there's actually a documentary about that aspect of her life. And what she does, she calls herself the cardboard cobbler, and she creates work out of paper and cardboard. And she talks about when she was a young girl building submarines and houses out of boxes in her backyard, which I did as a kid too. The Autry Museum was doing a series called Out West, organized in part by Gregory Hinton, and it was identifying queer community elements that were unnoticed or hidden in the collection of the Autry Museum. So we came up with the idea of doing a trading post in the Autry gift shop, in which she would recreate an entire trading post of bags of sugar and guitars and hats and belts in the gift shop as if you were in a trading post, but they were all made of cardboard, and this is a pillow from the Out West project at the Autry Museum. So these are a couple of our scrapbooks that we've been keeping over the years. We have about a dozen or 15 of these filled with exhibition announcements. Here's Julius Shulman signing his announcement from his first solo show. Edmund Teske congratulating our opening. Robbert Flick and David Leventhal. Peter Alexander reviews. Llyn Foulkes, Dean Stockwell, Llyn, Some of the other group exhibitions we've had here at Craig Krull Gallery include narrative painting in Los Angeles, Of Rope and Chain, Her Bones Are Made, which included 9 LA women artists, and most recently, Seguimos, Contemporary Art in Costa Rica, curated by Hannah Sloan. So my gallery program has definitely evolved over the years from being purely photo-based to virtually every media. And one of the things that we're interested in recently are ceramic arts, and we've featured a number of very important ceramic artists: Brittany Mojo, Chris Miller, Claudia Solorzano, Jorge Jimenez, Peter Olson, Elizabeth Scott, Taylor Kibbe, and a lot of them are women. And we're also featuring a lot of textile work by people like Lavial Campbell, Diane Silver, and Katrin Asenby, one of the artists from Costa Rica. Some of the artists that I've been working with since the beginning here at Bergamot Station include Astrid Preston, Dane McCleary, Hilary Brace, Jeff Browse, Masao Yamamoto, Woods Davey, Greg Colson, Ned Evans, John Huggins, Nancy Monk, Robin Mitchell, Jenny Oken, Pamela Smith Hudson, Lavial Campbell, and Kelly Berg. One of the greatest pleasures for me as an art dealer doesn't even happen in the gallery. It's the opportunity that I have to visit artists in their studios. It's a rare privilege because not many people get to go to the studios and talk to the artists personally, intimately about their work while it's happening, while it's being made, while the mistakes are happening, while the new ideas are coming out. It's a laboratory. And it's also, I'm privileged because I get to talk to them about the work and give them input, which they're interested to hear. So I enjoy that part of the process, and to see how it develops into an exhibition. Even if I don't represent the artists, I love going to studios and meeting people and seeing what they're doing in Los Angeles. So this is our 30th year at Bergamot Station, and I've seen it change quite a bit. We've lost some people. Burnett, Patty, both passed away. It's been an ever-evolving and changing atmosphere here, but it continues to be vibrant, and I'm lucky to be here. I'm lucky to open that door every day, and I look at the paint on the walls, the pock marks from being spackled, and I see my history. I see my history and my name on the front door with the cracks that are shaping on my name. And I see patterns on the concrete floor from the thousands of people who have been through here. And I think about the almost 500 exhibitions that I've done over the years. It's been a family. It's been a very close relationship with over 100 artists. 65 I represent now, but hundreds I've shown over the years. And lost some dear friends, James Fee, Julius Shulman, and we've had memorials in my gallery. We've had 6 or 7 memorials now in this gallery, and it's part of the life process, and I am not looking to move ever. I have a deep sense of place, and this is a home to me, and so much has happened to me in this space right here, and I look forward to many more years. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the women that have worked with me over these past 30 years as my gallery directors. Jennifer Tripp, Colleen Donaghy, Kelly Barretts, Beth Parker, Laurel Rand Lewis, Elisa Polishuk, Bridget Leslie, and now Alina Edwards. Thank you for being with me and helping me.